Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 17th installment of our Acadiana Business Resource webinar series. My name is Keely Miller, and I work on the team here at One Acadiana. In March 2020, One Acadiana joined with business resource partners from around the region to host a series of webinars on timely and relevant topics for our regional business community, particularly our small businesses, as we responded to recovery needs from the COVID-19 pandemic. Topics range from federal aid programs to COVID-19's impacts on specific industries, and we talked about reopening, recovery, and safety. Our webinar series continues today with a presentation by the PCARD Group on additional funding heading to state and local governments this year. So after the presentation, we'll use the remaining time for Q&A. As you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A feature. We'll be monitoring the questions submitted as we go, and we will try to get to as many of those as possible. We're also recording the webinar, which we'll share with all registered participants in a follow-up email. At this point, I'll hand it off to One Acadiana's President and CEO, Troy Wayman, for some opening remarks. Troy?
Thank you, Keely, and thank all of you for joining us this morning. For those of you not familiar with One Acadiana serves two roles. We serve as the Chamber of Commerce for Lafayette, but we also serve as a regional economic development organization serving 9 parishes across Acadiana. We're very excited to be a convener in this realm, to bring the business community together and to provide information on very relative topics, specifically as it relates, over this past year, as it's related to COVID-19 and the other issues that we faced across our community. We perceive ourselves as a purveyor of fact. We vet information and we present it to our business community so that they can discern exactly what the information is. To that end, we partner with one of our strongest partners, the PCARD Group, to do a number of these presentations. We also want to thank the Council for Better Louisiana and the Regional Economic Development Alliance for Louisiana, the REAL Group, the regional economic development organizations across Louisiana, for joining us on this event and collaborating with us on this event. At this point, I will turn it over to the leader of the PCARD Group, Mr. Tyron Picard.
Thank you, Troy, and many thanks to One Acadiana, as well as the Regional Economic Alliance for Louisiana and the Council for a Better Louisiana for affording us the opportunity to partner with them on this hopefully very educational webinar today from two of our partners in our Washington, D.C. office. These are certainly unprecedented times in our nation as it relates to the pandemic, as well as it relates to the economic stimulus response to the pandemic. And knowing how to navigate those opportunities, we think can be transformational both for our state and Louisiana, as well as parish and local governments. The amount of money which is going to be distributed certainly can have not only a real economic lift to all of those public entities and communities, but certainly change the face of the current infrastructure situation, healthcare situation, education situation. And so it's our pleasure to be able to offer you this information to hopefully better navigate. I know we have a number of elected officials who are with us today. Hopefully this will educate you all about those resources so you can begin to make plans on what is the best course for the elected bodies that you serve. Who's the PCARD Group? Well, we're a 10-year-old state and federal governmental affairs and business consulting firm with offices in Baton Rouge, Washington, D.C., Lafayette, and Lake Charles. Very pleased today to have two of our partners from the Washington office with us who will be presenting the substance of the presentation. Emily Baque de Silva, I should say, is a Lafayette native who formerly was a legislative staffer for former U.S. Senator John Breaux and has worked with the PCARD Group for the past 10 years. And pleased to have Emily with us today. Hunter Hall is a former staffer for U.S. Senator Bill Cassidy and after that served as a presidential appointee to the United States Department of Commerce prior to joining the PCAR group. Hunter's a native of Baton Rouge, and like Emily, is based in our Washington, D.C. office. So I want to thank both of them for the excellent preparation and presentation that they've done today. And I'm going to go ahead and jump right in and turn it over to Emily.
Thanks, Tyron. Thank you for having us this morning. So Hunter and I are going to touch on a number of federal funding opportunities for state and local governments this morning. Of course, first off is the American Rescue Plan. And as Tyron mentioned, it really is transformational. Next slide, please. It totals $1.9 trillion. And honestly, the state and local relief portion is one of the biggest. It totals $350 billion. As Tyron was saying, we really haven't seen anything like this in recent years. And certainly you all will get direct funding coming your way. Two other things we wanted to touch on is Fy22 Appropriations, which you all may be familiar with the appropriations process. And 10 years ago, Congress eliminated earmarks, but you may remember that, in the 90s and early 2000s, earmarks were a really easy way for members of Congress to send money back to state and local governments and other entities in their districts. Well, it looks like this year that House Democrats are in fact bringing back earmarks. They are calling them community project funding. And they will be a little bit different, but it will be direct funding for specific projects. And then, of course, surface transportation and infrastructure. We expect that to be kind of the next big priority for both the administration and Congress. If you look at the American Rescue Plan, President Biden and Congress, called that relief. And next, they said, would be recovery. And so we expect, again, a large package to start to move later this summer. And in fact, again, House Democrats are saying that there could be specific earmarked funding for projects in that bill as well. So we'll touch on all three. So now I'll kick it over to Hunter to start the discussion around the American Rescue Plan.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you for coming today. As Emily said, the American Rescue Plan is a massive package. It's $1.9 trillion. It includes everything from $130 billion to reopen K through 12 schools, $40 billion for universities and colleges. But the most important thing that this brings for today is the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery fund. In this, Congress provided $350 billion in new COVID relief funds to support state and local budgets impacted by excess expenses, reduced revenues, and to support first responders, to support healthcare and other essential frontline workers. Now, they divided this $350 billion into two buckets. The first bucket is $195 billion for states and the District of Columbia. These will come direct from the Department of Treasury. And for instance, Governor John Bel Edwards' office is going to receive, it's estimated to receive $3.2 billion for the state of Louisiana. And this is a separate pot from the parish and city funds. $195 billion for the states and the District of Columbia. The other pot is for local governments, for parishes and cities. This is $130.2 billion. That's going to be divided evenly between parishes and cities. And bear with us while we explain the details here. They split into this bucket into two pots at $65.1 billion each. The first is for parishes, and that $65 billion is divvied up amongst parishes and counties around the country based on population. The other $65.1 billion is also separated into two buckets. $45.5 billion of the $65 billion for cities is going to be distributed based on a modified CDBG formula for cities with a population over 50,000. There's remaining $19.5 billion that is going to be distributed based on a share of the state population for municipalities with a population under 50,000, or what the bill calls non-entitlement government entities. Again, 195 billion for states, of which Louisiana is estimated to receive about 3.2 billion, and then 130 billion for local governments, split in half. 65 billion for parishes based on population, and then 65 billion for cities. 45 billion going to cities over 50,000, 19.5 billion going to cities under 50,000. Now, every city and parish above 50,000 in population is going to receive their funds directly from the Treasury Department. And we'll get into those details shortly. For municipalities and for the local governments with a population under 50,000, you're actually going to receive your allocation from the state. Now, again, that is a separate allocation from the $3.2 billion. In these, there are eligible sub-recipients. Next slide. The eligible sub-recipients of a state and local government include ports, universities, judicial systems, certain private nonprofit organizations, and what they call public benefit corporations involved in the transportation of passengers and cargo. And we know you all are going to have some questions on all this. We're happy to ask them to answer them. But for now, I'm going to throw it back over to Emily to talk about the timeline and how these funds are going to come down.
Thanks, Hunter. Yes, next slide, please. You got it. So let's talk about, when you should expect to see these funds headed your way. And again, as Hunter noted, there are two different kind of buckets. We'll focus first on parishes and municipalities with a population over 50,000. And so, although not in statute, we expect Treasury to release FAQs in the next few weeks, FAQs or some sort of guidance that will likely include some sort of certification that a parish or city administrator will need to complete in order to receive the funds. If it's similar to how the CARES CRF dollars flowed, it will be wired to an account that is connected to the parish or city. So you will expect to receive the first 50% no later than 60 days after enactment. So as an example, the city of Lafayette is estimated to receive a total of $36 million. The city could expect half, or $18 million, by around May 10th. We'll talk about the parish. The Lafayette Parish is expected to receive around $47.4 million. So they would receive half, approximately $23.7 million, on or around May 10th. And then you would receive the second half basically a year later. So the city would receive the additional 18 million no earlier than probably May 10th, 2022. Then the parish would receive the additional 23.7 million around that time as well. We do want to note that all of these dollars must be expended by December 31st, 2024. Next slide, please. Now, as far as municipalities with a population under 50,000, it's a little bit more complicated for you all because, as Hunter said, it's got to flow through the state first. So basically, Treasury has up to 60 days to send the funds to the state of Louisiana. The state will then have 30 days to distribute the funds, but the state can ask for an extension up to 120 days. Now, again, if they do not distribute the funds within the 120 days, they will face a monetary penalty. And so they would owe Treasury whatever it is they have not sent to you, and the amount they owe them would have to come out of the state allocation, not your allocation. One other thing to note is that states cannot change the allocations or impose additional requirements on the municipalities that are under 50,000. And again, that funding needs to be expended by December 31st, 2024. And then briefly on the timeline for states, Hunter mentioned states will receive a completely different pot, a separate allocation totaling $195.3 billion. And states will receive this allocation within 60 days of submitting a certification of need to Treasury. And again, that must be expended by December 31st, 2024. Next slide, please. Now we'll get to eligible uses of funding. So number one, respond to the public health emergency with respect to COVID-19 or its negative economic impacts. This includes assistance to households, small businesses, and nonprofits, or aid to impacted industries such as tourism, travel, and hospitality. Now, it's not limited to just these. These are simply examples for you. You can also use the funding to provide premium pay to essential workers up to $13 in additional wages, or excuse me, $13 an hour in additional wages. I think as Hunter mentioned, think of first responders, police, fire, etc. Now, the bill does impose a cap of $25,000 for any single eligible worker. You can also use the funding to replace lost revenue. And this is huge because the CARE CRF dollars did not allow this. And so this is something that state and local governments really pushed on, I'd say, since last April. So you think of, a decrease in property or income tax due to the public health emergency relative to revenues collected in the most recent fiscal year of the state, city, or parish prior to the emergency, which is January 2020. And then you can use it to make necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. Now, while we're talking about eligible uses, I'm just going to point out what it cannot be used for. So it does say in statute, states are not allowed to use the funds to either directly or indirectly offset a reduction in net tax revenue that results from a change in law, regulation, or administrative interpretation during the covered period that reduces any tax. So if a state violates this provision, it would be required to repay the amount of the applicable reduction to net tax revenue. Also, no fund shall be deposited into any pension fund. So I just want to flag those two things. Next slide, please. Now, there is another pot for state funding, and it's $10 billion to carry out critical capital projects. It relates to enabling work, education, and health monitoring, including remote options in response to the COVID-19 public health emergency. Now, honestly, in conversations that Hunter and I have had with staff and members, this pot is really for states to use to build out broadband infrastructure. But there's kind of an archaic way in which the bill had to be written in order to pass with a simple majority. And so that's why you see these terms. Now, we are going to receive guidance from Treasury on kind of what this competitive grant process will look like. And so I think we'll get a little bit more detail, but as of now, we do think that this is a big focus of this will be on broadband infrastructure. And then each state will receive a minimum of $100 million. States can receive an additional allocation based on population, number of individuals living in rural areas, and the proportion of individuals living below the poverty line. And again, what's interesting about this is that funding is available until expended. So there's no deadline in which you need to spend this money. And again, Treasury is required to establish a process of applying for these grants within 60 days of enactment. So in May, we should see the guidance related to this competitive grant program. One other thing to note before I pass it back to Hunter, immediately following the webinar, the PCARD group will share a document with you that outlines the House Oversight Committee's estimates for state and local funding. So the numbers that I mentioned related to the city and parish of Lafayette, we will send out a document that basically shows what the estimates are for every city and parish in the state of Louisiana. I'll now throw it back to Hunter to talk about FY22 appropriations.
Thank you, Emily. Another important event happening currently in DC is the appropriations process happens every year. One of the big changes for FY22 are what Emily mentioned earlier, the community project funding requests, otherwise known as earmarks. I'll use those terms interchangeably. For those of you familiar with the appropriations process and with earmarks, House Democrats have decided to move forward with these member requests with House Appropriations releasing guidelines this week. Outlining what that would look like. We expect the Senate Democrats to release similar guidance soon. One thing to note, House and Senate Republicans have not announced yet whether they will participate in these community project funding requests in these earmarks. However, House Republicans are expected to hold a conference vote soon to decide whether their members will be allowed to introduce community project funding requests. Senate Republicans are expected to allow these earmark requests to move forward, but they've issued no timeline on their final decision. According to House Appropriations, the community project funding requests will adhere to these following guidelines, and it's unknown if the Senate is going to follow the same parameters. Again, still waiting on that guidance. Each member under the new rules will be able to request up to a total of 10 projects across the committee. So across the various subcommittees, up to a total of 10. And the members will be required to prioritize their community project requests when they are submitted to the member database. The expectation is that a member, if introducing 10 requests, the expectation is that they will receive funding for 3 or 4 total projects. Other guidelines, things that the Appropriations Committee is looking for: each project must have a demonstrated community support, which includes but isn't limited to letters of support from elected community leaders like mayors or other officials, press articles that highlight the need for this project, support from newspaper editorial boards, projects that are listed on the state intended use plans, community development plans, and other publicly available planning documents. They also include resolutions passed by city councils or boards. Again, this isn't an exhaustive list, just a list of examples. They are also going to require the members of Congress, when they introduce these requests, must report these requests on their house.gov website at the time the request is made. Now, that's house.gov because that's the House rules. Again, we're not sure if the Senate is going to follow those same rules. As expected, the committee is imposing a ban on directing earmarks to for-profit entities. Members are encouraged to consider public entities as primary grantees to oversee the completion of the project. So state, local governments, mayors, municipalities, etc. And the final thing on this: each project request has to be for FY22 or the year in which that project is, year of that appropriations request. It cannot be a request for multi-year or recurring funding. The last thing I'll add is, yes, this is a return of earmarks, but that does not mean that programmatic and language requests, as members have been using the last 10 years, it doesn't mean they're going away. These earmarks are just in addition to that regular appropriations process. And I'll toss it back over to Emily to talk about surface transportation and the potential for an infrastructure package.
Thanks, Hunter. So as I mentioned at the start of the webinar, the American Rescue Package is, the Biden administration's focus on relief. And they've said the next big legislation that they want Congress to take up will be focused on recovery. And so that's this idea of Build Back Better. For those of you who are familiar with surface transportation authorization, it is the legislation that basically authorizes highway projects, and it usually lasts for about 5 years. Well, that is set to expire this August. So the idea is Congress needs to address surface transportation. And while they're doing that, that will likely be the anchor for a larger infrastructure package. So in terms of the timeline, we've heard that the administration will release some sort of proposal on what they want an infrastructure package to look like in April. The committees of jurisdiction, so the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, those chairs have already said they want to get surface transportation marked up and out of committee before Memorial Day. Again, that would be the centerpiece for a larger infrastructure package. So we do think that, this summer there will be a focus on surface transportation and infrastructure, with an expectation that something could be signed into law this fall. Now, the House Democrats have already said that they do want to include community projects in an infrastructure package. And again, for those of you who have been around as long as I have, you remember that surface transportation, you think T21, you think Safe T-Lou, MAP 21, those had earmarks in them. And so they want to get back to that. As Hunter was just talking about, in terms of appropriations, you think of funding that can be spent in 1 year. But when you think of surface transportation, since it's a 5-year authorization, the funding here can be a little bit larger. So, you think of what can be spent over the life of the bill on a particular project. Again, we haven't seen any guidance yet, and we expect that to come out later this spring or early this summer in terms of community projects. But we just want you all to be thinking about it. And again, this is something that only House Democrats have voiced their support for. We expect some sort of ruling to come from the Republican conference in the next few weeks. But again, this may be, just other opportunities for additional funding that can flow to state and local governments. So that is what we have for you all, and, happy to answer any questions.
Wonderful. Thank y'all both. And yeah, at this point, we do have a good portion of time for questions. And if you have any questions, just a reminder, continue to enter them in the Q&A feature. And we will get to as many of these as possible. So with that, I will hand it over to Tyron to facilitate the Q&A. Tyron?
Thank you. And we do have a couple of questions that have already come in. I wanted to just make one comment, I guess because I am old enough to remember, after 21 years of working in Washington, the days of earmarks. And obviously, they became a dirty word, mainly in the media, but the reality of what the earmark era versus the post-earmark era was is congressmen were able to essentially ascertain what the needs were in their district, whether it is a crucial road to a port or something of the like, and make those requests for funding. When the earmarks ban came in, that input was significantly diminished, and you began to essentially have people making decisions in Washington who maybe never even saw that port or that road and didn't understand the economic significance of it being a surface arterial to a major shipping infrastructure. And so I like to say that the money was being spent in a way that the representatives who were elected had a keen understanding of what the needs were of that area versus allowing someone who might have just been a career civil servant sitting in a building in Washington, D.C. to make that decision. And so keep that in mind, I guess, as the debate moves on. So one of the first questions that came in was this. You said I could use my parish funds for water, sewer, and broadband. Can I use my allocation as a down payment or even full payment on infrastructure projects such as roads or bridges?
So the short answer is yes. However, we expect Treasury to issue their specific guidance soon. The point of these funds was to combat the COVID-19 pandemic through an economic stimulus. So there's potential, though we'll want to wait for Treasury to be sure that these funds could be used on roads and bridges, as those are typically seen as job creators and an economic booster. So yes, we expect them to be, but we do want to be sure that that it falls within the guidance that Treasury issues. And if they follow congressional intent, we expect those to be eligible.
One other question was some confusion about the units of state and local government and their eligibility as sub-recipients of both state funding as well as the separate pot for local funding. Could you clarify that?
Sure. So, the statute says that units of state and local government would be eligible for both funding from cities and parishes, and then also sub-recipients of the state pot. So they would have multiple, bites at the apple as sub-recipients.
Sure. And another question is, if you could articulate a little more on how the state will control the flow of funds to the municipalities, and if there's any guidance or process that's been articulated about that.
So I think what's interesting, I guess we need to remember there are two pots, right, for states. So, or I should say, there's one pot specifically for states that Hunter mentioned. And I think he said the state of Louisiana is expected to get about 3.2 billion from that pot. That we don't know. That will be up to the state to decide how that money will flow. And I'm sure some of that could go to local governments. Now, I think the funding that you're talking about is the funding for local governments that are below 50,000 in population. And of course, their funding has to flow through the state before it gets to them. What is in statute right now basically says the state can't put any sort of requirements on that money. They are simply the middleman, and it needs to flow to these governments that have less than 50,000. It needs to flow straight to them. I think the question is how soon. And so again, states, well, I should say Treasury will have 60 days to push that money to the states. And then the states have 30 days from that time to push it to the municipalities that are less than 50,000 in population. The states can ask for an extension of up to 120 days. But it should flow hopefully within the first 30 days.
Two more quick questions on clarification. Confirming there is no match requirement for communities that is tied to any of these, the receipt of any of these funds, correct?
That is correct. There's no match requirement.
Okay, and the use of the funds on the local, municipal and parish level, it can be used for things such as purchasing equipment for public safety.
Yes.
Okay.
In that question about the project match, so there is no match. I just want to clarify, there is no match to receive these funds. However, if these funds are going towards a project that that would require a local match, I think guidance is going to determine whether these funds can be used as the local match. We expect them to be available, but if you want to gear that towards a specific project as your local match, we do believe these funds would be able to be used for that.
Here's a more, well, those were the easy questions. So here's a more complex question. The legislature has, and leadership of the legislature has announced that we're going to undertake some efforts at tax reform this coming legislative session. Specifically, things such as a reduction of the elimination of the inventory tax, centralized sales tax collection, and a reduction potentially in the rate of the state income tax through the elimination of a number of exemptions. So here's the question. If the state legislature enacts tax restructuring that lowers taxes, but is still revenue neutral overall for the state, would that be permissible without violating the provisions of receiving this funding?
No, there's very strict language in this bill that prevents state legislatures, city councils, parish and county boards and councils from using this in any way to lower or eliminate a tax that is already on the books.
So here's a key caveat on that, Hunter, is a key caveat on that is if it's revenue neutral and if the pay for is coming from the elimination of exemptions versus this funding. So let's distinguish that. In other words, the lowering of the rate is going to be paid for by eliminating a number of exemptions, not by substituting this revenue. Just for clarification. So go ahead, Emily.
I would just say on its face, I think that would work. I mean, the language in the statute states that states are not allowed to use the funds to either directly or indirectly offset a reduction in the net tax revenue.
Right.
So if net tax revenue, if it stays neutral, we should be in good shape. Again, I expect we will see quite a bit of guidance from Treasury on this, but it sounds like on its face, that would be okay.
Apologies, I missed that part in the middle with
right. Well, it's something that it could easily be confused because making sure that people understand that the pay for the offset to get to that point to make it revenue neutral would be an elimination of exemptions. It wouldn't be plugging this money in, right? So thank you. Are there any reporting requirements for states and local governments that are receiving these funds?
I think as we stated earlier, there's going to be some, but all of that is going to be released in the Treasury guidance that we expect to come out in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah,
Okay.
and the statute basically said local governments would be required to provide periodic reports. So yes, and to Hunter's point, we'll get more details from Treasury.
Right. And the numbers that we're going to release in the printed materials after this for each of the municipalities and parishes in the state, those are confirmed, right? Those aren't estimates.
Those are estimates, actually.
Those are
estimates.
okay.
Those are from the House Committee on Oversight.
Okay.
Those are their estimates, and it will be Treasury who ultimately decides what the funding will be.
Okay.
I think the House Committee feels pretty confident that these are in the ballpark, but I mean, don't take these to the bank, down to the last number, but we think they're close.
What about school districts? Are school districts, they are an eligible recipient of the local government funding and potentially of the state government pot of money, right?
They are an eligible sub-recipient, yes. Well, they can collect from state, parish, and local funds. They can receive from each of those pots.
Right, but they would be sub-recipients, right?
Correct, sub-recipients.
And remember, they will be receiving their own pot of money. There was quite a bit of money going to K through 12. Separately, that would flow from the state. In addition,
130 billion roughly.
Okay. And there was some confusion from one of the webinar attendees about the timing on the release of the two tranches of money. There are going to be 2 and not 3 allocations, right? 50% in the next 60 days, and then 50% in roughly 1 year from now, which all of which has to be used by 12/31/24. Is that accurate? So that's accurate. Hopefully that clarifies that. Let's talk about the community project funding, which is akin to the old earmark methods. How does someone submit a community project funding request to the Louisiana delegation?
So we first need to hear from the Republican conference and if they plan to, in fact, make these types of requests. I assume if they decide to go forward, each member will provide kind of the request guidelines for local constituents to make those requests to the members. Okay.
So essentially, once the Republican conference makes a decision, then we'll have a better idea of what process will look like. And we expect that decision will be made by the Republican conference within the coming weeks.
Yeah. House Dems are already collecting their requests from their constituents. And so House Republicans, if they want to be included, are going to need to move a little quicker. And Tyron, real quick, I saw a question on here from Lafayette Travel. It says, is there any reference to projects having to be shovel ready, or is it has to be completed by the end of 2024? And there is no reference to the project being shovel ready or that it has to be completed by 2024. The statute states that the funds must be expended by the deadline in 2024.
Okay. We have a question from a parish president. Can these funds be used, the local funds be used to pay off debt services such as bonds that are creating a financial burden for a parish?
I would say we need to wait on the guidance to be safe. all of this has to be to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. And so if there's a debt service that is hindering COVID-19 pandemic response and relief, there's maybe a way, but I would wait on the guidance for that. To be safe for now, I would err on the side of caution and say, no, we want to wait on the guidance. But again, all of this all of these funds have to go towards combating the COVID-19 pandemic.
And
Okay.
I would just add, because I think there are going to be some like very specific questions. If Treasury follows the model that they used for the CRF dollars from CARES, their FAQs were answering very specific questions like this. So I think that, at some point, these types of questions need to get elevated to Treasury. And we certainly can help with that if necessary. But I think these are the kinds of questions that need to make their way to Treasury so you can get, an exact answer.
Right. We talked some about the community projects being included in the larger surface transportation and infrastructure package. Give us an idea of the. We've heard a lot that the administration is going to key in on this T&I package, probably with a lot of green transportation alternatives, things which reduce carbon footprint, whether it's mass transportation, rail, things of the like. As well as incentives for conversion of vehicles to renewable fuel. So, to what degree do you expect? Do you expect that there'll be a heavy influence on the within the T&I funding for incentives that will be related to reduction of carbon and alternative fuels?
I think there'll be a big focus, and not necessarily from the T&I component, but from energy and commerce, from their piece as well. I think on the T&I side, you'll see a big focus on climate and resiliency and how to address climate change. So, things that can help us in terms of resiliency for hurricanes and those types of natural disasters. I think that's going to be a big component in terms of kind of the policies that they are putting forward.
With respect to the use of funds that states receive, is there any indicated prohibition at this point? I know we're still waiting on the Treasury guidance. Is there any indication at this point that the state would be prohibited from using some of that funding for NGOs, non-governmental organizations?
So in the language, as I stated earlier, they do list certain nonprofit organizations, and the definition that is the definition of private nonprofit organization for this bill is an organization that meets four standards: no part of the net earnings which inures to the benefit of any member, founder, contributor, or individual. It must have a voluntary board and has an accounting system or has a designated fiscal agent in accordance with requirements established by the secretary, and practices non-discrimination in the provision of assistance. Under that guideline, I would think the NGO would fall under that. But again, we do want to wait on the guidance, but based on that definition, I would say the NGO would fall under that.
And they would be eligible for both the state funding and the local government funding.
Correct.
Okay, very good. And again, we are going to distribute to all the call recipients a spreadsheet which posts those amounts, and I'm going to see if we can also put those on the PCARD Group website, which is www.thepcardgroup.com. Hunter, Emily, talk a little bit about life in a divided Senate that is operating on a 51-50 majority, which is a dynamic we have not seen in quite some time. and what that has done, I guess, for the balance of power, for the moderates that are in the middle between moderate Republicans, moderate Democrats in the Senate, and what that could mean as far as the process on these pieces of legislation going forward.
Well, I'll start, and I'll just point out that I think those moderates were the big power players in the American Rescue Plan. I'm sure you heard about some of the things that were pulled out of the House bill that was really, tailored towards some of the progressives in the Democratic Party. But, ultimately, minimum wage was the increase to $15 was stripped out. That was done by the parliamentarian, but honestly, it wouldn't have lasted because of the moderates. And then the unemployment benefit, the additional benefit in the House bill was $400 a week, and it bumped down to $300 a week in the Senate. So I think you'll see the Senate kind of be, moderate what the House plans to do. I think moving forward, I would just say it'll be interesting to see what happens with an infrastructure package. Again, you may have read that with the American Rescue Plan, basically the administration and the Democratic majorities in the House and Senate decided to move forward with just a simple majority by using a special tool. And so that basically shut out Republicans. They can do that again with infrastructure. And I think they're wanting to go in a bipartisan fashion. But they may end up using reconciliation if they feel like they can't pick off enough Republicans. But again, you'll still have those moderates in the Senate in particular, kind of holding their feet to the fire on what is actually included. Hunter, any additional thoughts?
No, I think you covered it. I think members are particular about who they're working with, and I think they're very specific about not aligning with certain folks from the other party that may represent certain ideals that they don't, which makes sponsorships for certain bills and makes working together a little more difficult. We're hoping to see that kind of reside a little bit as time moves on. But you are seeing a little bit more bipartisan, some sharper elbows in the bipartisan ship going on up here. It's always been prevalent, but it seems to be a little more prevalent these days. And as Emily said, it's getting better. They do want to do this infrastructure package in a bipartisan manner. That's what folks are saying, and so we'll see how that plays out.
And honestly, one of the things I guess we should mention is that earmarks or community funding may help with that. Back in the day when you used to be able to earmark, that was kind of the carrot in order to get members to vote on certain bills. If they knew that they had certain projects or in their district that were going to be funded, and things seem to work a little more smoothly than they do now. And so I think there is some hope that maybe if in fact these Republicans decide they want to move forward with the Democrats on these community projects, that may help, kind of grease the wheels on some other legislation that needs to move.
Right.
Emily, Hunter, the name of New Orleans native Shalonda Young has been mentioned as a potential frontrunner for the director of the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. And with the recent recall of the original presidential selection for that, who failed to get confirmation. Talk a little bit about, if you would, the significance for the state of Louisiana of having someone who is a Louisiana, New Orleans native being the director of the Office of Management and Budget.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. I mean, it's better than not, right?
Right.
OMB, people don't always think about OMB, but they are really the ones who create the president's budget, and they have tentacles into every agency. And so again, I think it's better to have someone there that has a connection to the state than not. And so I think it can only help Louisiana and some of the critical needs that we have.
And one thing I'll add about Shalonda in her hearings, She is someone that has garnered a significant amount of bipartisan support. Everyone from the entire Democratic side all the way over to Lindsey Graham and Mike Lee and Senator John Kennedy have all praised her for her bipartisanship, for her intellect, for her way of handling things, and just her general demeanor. And so I think that is going to play very well for Louisiana and for OMB and for the country, having that type of bipartisanship when determining that government, when determining the government budget. I think that's something that we definitely should highlight is that she received compliments across the board from Republicans and Democrats.
Let's talk a little bit about, as we're talking about sort of the complexion of this administration and who the players are. We, all of our delegation was returned with, obviously, with the exception of the tragic passing of Congressman-elect Luke Letlow. But we'll have Congressman Garrett Graves returning to the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee with more seniority. Congressman Higgins returning to the Oversight Committee with more seniority, as well as Homeland Security with more seniority. Obviously, Congressman Scalise maintaining his position as the number 2 person in the Republican conference. Talk a little bit about the Senate and what I guess this session of or term of Congress is going to mean in terms of influence changes and for our 2 senators, Cassidy and Kennedy.
So one of the biggest changes this year was obviously Senator Kennedy becoming the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Energy and Water. This controls WERDA and a number of other project specific programs that are funding. I'm sorry?
Corps of Engineers.
Corps of Engineers and a number of project specific programs, programs that fund projects all over the country. But having him as he would have been the ranking member on that subcommittee, it's going to be very important for bringing down funds for projects in Louisiana. Think ports and rivers and anything water related. That's going to be very important. Senator Cassidy has increased his stature on both Senate Finance and Senate Health, and his vote with President Trump or to convict President Trump in the trial, while that is contentious, especially in Louisiana, he has garnered a number of Democrat friends up here that will allow him to create partnerships and be involved in legislation and discussions that he otherwise wouldn't have been. And I think it's made him it made him eligible to work with a number of Democrats across the board. And I think overall, he's going to be able to do a lot more for Louisiana with these relationships and with these partnerships working across the aisle.
Oh, and just, I wanted to interject, Tyron, we are at last question territory. So I don't know if you have one last question hanging out there or if any parting words of wisdom. That
should do it. So much to unpack in 1 hour. I can't ever remember certainly a first quarter of a congressional term where so much is going on, both that has moved through the process as well as is on the drawing board for the second quarter of the year. So much to unpack, and so we really appreciate the opportunity to partner with the cable. The Real Economic Development Group and One Acadiana to bring you this information, and stay tuned, because a lot more clarity will be emerging both from the Treasury as it relates to the guidance on the funding at the state and local level here, in addition to some of the preliminary plans as it relates to the transportation and infrastructure package, as well as the community funding components that were discussed earlier. So thank you again. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Hunter, for the excellent preparation and presentation. And I'll turn it back to you, Keely or Troy.
Wonderful. Yeah, I do have a little bit of housekeeping at the end, but Troy, if you have any also parting words of wisdom, wanted to give you the chance for that as well.
Trying to get my camera to work. There we go. I don't know that they're parting words of wisdom, but I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And again, thank the P-Card Group for their knowledge and their ability to relay this information. Another way to put it, I guess, put the hay down where the goats can get it. And we greatly appreciate it. And we greatly appreciate the partnership. And as Keely has mentioned a number of times, the information, the presentation will be available for all those that registered, as well as some additional information from the P-Card Group. So again, thank you all for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Yes,
Thanks.
thank you so much, everyone. That brings us to the end of today's webinar. Thanks
Thank
again
you.
to the P-Card Group's team,
Thank you.
Byron, Emily, and Hunter for the presentation. And thanks to all of our participants for joining us. Just another reminder, we will be sharing the video recording of this webinar as well as the document the P-Card Group mentioned with the funding allocation estimates. We'll be sending that after this webinar, so you will receive an email from the P-Card Group as well as an email from One Acadiana. So thank you again for participating, and all of these materials also will be available at oneacadiana.org/webinars. Thanks everyone again, and everybody please stay safe.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you.